Everything that they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The word of the Lord.
Praise be to God.
So we continue our America 250 series. We've talked about Thomas Paine. We've talked about the Declaration of Independence. Last week we talked about the Constitutional Convention. And today we're going to talk about someone who is very well known, George Washington. And so I put this is the only portrait I have of George with me today. So we got George up here on the altar there. So what do you know about George Washington? Anything? Anybody blurt out anything they've heard about this guy? Anything?
He had wooden teeth.
He what?
He had wooden teeth.
He had wooden teeth.
He did?
That's what I.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the rumor, huh?
It's
Okay.
adventures, yeah, his adventures are wooden.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Well, is he the one that is the story about the cherry tree?
apparently.
You know, yeah, he wouldn't tell a lie, he confessed to cutting
Yeah.
it down.
He didn't want to be president either, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He didn't want to be president, and he was president. So those are some things we know about him. But largely, we tend to make these figures in history mythical figures, and they're not actually human by the time we get 250 years from them, right? And we run this kind of temptation to do this to Jesus too. Particularly, God sent Jesus to be human, right? And live among us, and yet we then tend to, over time, make him deity. And it's the same thing with George Washington. And so, in Matthew 23, Matthew warns the early Christian converts not to call anyone on earth father, for he says, you have one Father and he is in heaven. Yet in colonial America, one man was consistently considered the father of the nation. This guy, George Washington. Yet, perhaps heeding the words of Matthew, Washington eschewed the spotlight and the adulation. In fact, when his luster dimmed in his second term as the first president of the United States, his opponents chided he was the stepfather of the nation. It was a jab at him. And yet Washington felt more comfortable being called the stepfather of the nation than the father of the nation. That's how his mind operated. He was fine with the downgrade, for he never sought to be exalted among his peers. Matthew talks at length in chapter 20 and again in chapter 23 about greatness. In 20:26, he says, whoever wants to be great must be a servant. And in Matthew 23:11 and 12, he writes, the greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Time and time again, the man whom history has deemed the greatest American, George Washington, relinquished power and chose to serve others and the greater good rather than his own self-interest or ego. So who was this George Washington? What did he actually do to flip the mindset of America from monarchies and dictators to republic and democracy? Well, let's go back a little bit. He was born in Virginia, so he was born in the States, which was different than a lot of people. We talked about Thomas Paine a few weeks ago, and he was born over in jolly old England. So a lot of the early colonists and colonial leaders were not born here, but Washington was. He's born in Virginia, 1732, to Episcopalian parents. He had only 5 years of formal education. But then something happened. At age 11, his dad died. So that kind of changed the trajectory of his life, and his formal education was done. But fortunately for Washington, he was raised by his older half-brother, who was a devout Christian. At age 15, Washington became a surveyor. That's kind of cool. So you go out and plot the land and figure out the topography of it and where the, border lines should be and put the stake in and that sort of thing. So he started that at 15, and he saved every penny he had doing that. And by age 17, he'd accumulated $500, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but that was a lot of money back then. That meant he was very, very miserly with his money. And he took that $500 and he bought a large tract of land. It's interesting, huh? And so then he began to allow freemen and dissenters to work the land, to rent the land, to utilize that land. And so he became familiar with them, but he also became a bit of a businessman. And so over his dealings, from age 15 as a surveyor, over the next 10 years, he gained a reputation for, quote, being a man who was so restrained in manner, fair in his dealings, and genuinely interested in the well-being of others. What a high compliment, huh? He was restrained, he was fair, and he was interested in others. It's pretty cool.
Mhm.
So at age 24, his peers seemed to see this, whatever it was, this specialness about Washington. At age 24, he was elected to the Virginia House, and he joined the Virginia militia. He did well over those next few years in the Virginia House. He was thought of as a well-reasoned representative of the people, always with their best interest in mind. He was also good in the militia with arms and military kind of strategy, that sort of thing. And so 20 years later, as he kind of rose in stature and rank, he was named the commander of the Continental Army. Now, that may have been a blessing or a curse, because remember, this is treasonous behavior. And you're at the top of the Continental Army, right? So you're the first one who's going to hang if this doesn't go well. So think about that. You think, oh, I'm the commander of the army. That's really cool. Well, okay. Be careful what you ask for. So Washington's leadership in the army revealed his belief system early on. Right away, he was faced with something that it had the potential to rip the army apart. And it was religious prejudice, bigotry, and bias. So let me give you a little bit of the backstory. There was a strong anti-Catholic bias growing in the United States, fueled by none other than Alexander Hamilton and Samuel Adams. Here you have two of the most powerful figures, these great thought leaders in the colonies, and they're fanning the flames of division through this anti-Catholic bias, right? And people listened to them because they were very smart people. They were very well renowned. And so Washington's kind of in the crosshairs of this. He knows that if this religious bigotry kind of catches fire within the army, it's going to split the army. And they don't have enough men to split because they're already fighting the mighty British, right? And so there's this incident where Colonel Benedict Arnold, anybody heard that name?
Oh, yeah.
He was of Connecticut, and he was a colonial colonel, was commissioned in 1775 to bring Canada into military union. But he kind of got off track a little bit, and Arnold planned what he called a Pope's Night to burn the Pope in effigy and force the Catholic French Canadians to renounce their Catholicism and join the U.S. fight against the British. That was Arnold's plan up in Canada. Washington didn't think this was a very good plan, maybe militarily or for just as a human. So Washington wrote to Arnold, his commanding general, on September 14th, 1775. And this all happened in the Ohio Territory north of the Ohio River. So right around here, actually, since we're just north of the Ohio River. Washington warns Arnold, Benedict Arnold, that harming, plundering, insulting, or injuring any Canadian or Indian will result in punishment up to and including death. So your plan, Mr. Benedict Arnold, has been thwarted. He goes on to say, avoid all disrespect or contempt of the religion of the country or its ceremonies. So he's saying you can't be biased against the Catholics. Then he goes on to say, where he's calling kind of a higher idealism, he says, lead with a Christian spirit and compassion and be mindful that God alone is judge of the hearts of men. He goes on within the leadership of the army to protect the free exercise of religion and to support those expressions. He also was adamant that if there were any incidents of ridicule or affront to particular religious expression, those would be dealt with severely, and those involved under his command would be punished. So he had no tolerance for that. He went on as general. July 4th, 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence, to forbid cursing, swearing, and drunkenness within the army. He didn't have much place for those. He also added, on July 9th, 1775, he added a paid chaplain to each regiment. He understood that what they were being called to do required them to process that with God. And so he thought chaplains were an important part of things. He also made it so that the troops had the opportunity of attending public worship. So even with their duties, he seemed to understand that they needed to be grounded in their faith and in God in order to do what they needed to do.
Wow.
On May 2nd, 1778, this is in the beginning times of the Revolutionary War where things are not going well. He said, quote, "While we are zealously performing the duties of good citizens and soldiers, we certainly ought not to be inattentive to the higher duties of religion." So right there, he's saying, yes, what we're doing is a high calling, but there is a higher calling. There is a higher allegiance than country, our faith. Faith demands, according to Washington, quote, "the warmest returns of gratitude and piety to the supreme author of all good." And so, as the war goes along, initially Washington is getting routed. He eventually turns the corner, and then in October 1781, British General Cornwallis, who decided to station his troops on a peninsula, not a good idea. Think about a peninsula. It's like you're in a dead end in a cul-de-sac, right? So they brought in the French ships into the harbor, and then they brought Washington's army up, and they basically routed them. It was kind of ugly. One of the biggest military gaffes in history. But so that happens. Then after Washington had kind of gotten on Benedict Arnold, Benedict Arnold actually flipped back to the British side. That's why we always talk about people as traitors being a Benedict Arnold, right? And so Benedict Arnold had been fighting against the colonial effort, but he saw the writing on the wall after Cornwallis was routed, and so he fled back to Britain. That's why he's well known to many of you. 1782, February, British House of Commons votes to end the war in America. But then it gets a little weird. So they've kind of beaten the British, but then things start to go awry within this. There's no central authority in America at that time. The Continental Congress is very weak. And so then you have all these things that are odd. Pennsylvania militiamen decide they're going to kill 100 pacifist Moravian Christian Indians in Ohio. So Washington isn't very pleased with that. He appoints Major General Henry Knox to be commander of West Point, and it's a move that he was already getting ready to divest himself of power, but we'll get to that in a minute. But he's laying that foundation for that. Then, in August 1782, Ohio's at the middle of a lot of this stuff, by the way. 1,000 American Revolution soldiers attack 5 Shawnee villages around Piqua, Ohio, and just absolutely massacre them. Then British Loyalists and American Indians defeat the militia down in Blue Lick, Kentucky, so that isn't good. So we're getting these skirmishes back and forth. Then the 1,000 American Revolution soldiers again go to Shawnee villages in Chillicothe, Ohio. I guess they were just running around causing trouble, and they burned the 5 villages and basically massacred a lot of people. And so you have all this stuff going on. Meanwhile, there's this pivotal event called the Newburgh Conspiracy. So they've essentially beat back the British. They haven't got all the paperwork signed and the I's dotted and the T's crossed. So the army's thinking they're pretty good and they can kind of do whatever they want. So they're routing Indians and they're doing a lot of things. Well, the Continental Congress has no money, so they're not paying these guys. So they're not paying their wages, and they're also not putting money in their pensions. So they're mad. And so they decide they're gonna march on the Continental Congress and basically create a military coup and take over the country. And so they are ready to roll on this thing. So there's only one guy who can stop this. It's George Washington. And so he goes to them and he basically says, look, you need to kind of knock it off here. This is not cool. This is not what we bled for all these years to gain our freedom. And they're not listening to him. And so he gives this very powerful speech. He basically, it kind of gets emotional and he begins to tear up. And nobody wore reading glasses back then. It was considered like a sign of weakness. It was a sign that you were becoming old and elderly and frail. And so Washington, he takes out his reading glasses and he puts those on and he basically says, "We have paid such a dear price, my friends, together. Let us not fumble this," essentially, as we approach the goal line. And I'm trying to think here if I've got the exact words. Let's see here. Yeah, it says he took his reading glasses, stating, "Gentlemen," this is a quote, will you permit me to put on my spectacles, because I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in service to my country." And so then he goes on to talk about how the military should be subordinate to civilian control. And that's what's the difference between America and some of the former powers in Europe. And so it quells the entire thing. This Newburgh conspiracy just disappears based on his words. And so then after he gets that quelled, they sign the Treaty of Paris, the war is over. He basically sends a letter to the Continental Congress to resign his position and disband the army. Here's the guy at the top of the entire heap in America. He can do no wrong, right? And he's like, "Okay, I'm done. I'm going to go back and be a private citizen." It is unheard of. It's just so amazing. And so he does that and he goes back into private life. Well, things continue to devolve. And we talked about Shays' Rebellion, right? We're up in Massachusetts. They were getting pretty rowdy and again, trying to overthrow the government. And so they decide that their Articles of Confederation are not enough. They need a constitutional convention. And so they invite 55 people together to Philadelphia in the summer. They spend 4 months doing that. But they need a president over that. That man they call is George Washington. So that's his second big thing. His first big thing was being the general over the Continental Army. The second is being the president of the Constitutional Convention. And what's interesting about that is they fought over everything that 4 months. I mean, it was rancorous debate. Yet Washington never got down in the weeds on that. He knew that there were a lot of little things that people cared passionately about it, but there was a larger goal in mind, that they needed to have some form of government come out of this that not only they could agree on, but the states could ratify. And so he only got involved when it was necessary to kind of push things ahead. I think about our Christian life and how sometimes we get down in the weeds so far about, how we do communion or what the sacraments are or any of these little embodiments of these things. And yet we miss the fact that we are only here as earthly citizens for a short time, right? We are on our way to be citizens of the heavenly kingdom, right? So we weaken ourselves when we get so far in the weeds, we fail to see that bigger goal. That was one of Washington's great gifts, was that he could see those bigger goals. He kept his eyes fixed beyond the moment. He wanted to get the Constitution kind of agreed to, and he wanted to get it ratified by the 13 colonies. So he does that, and at the end of September, they have this framework of a constitution, but they have to get it ratified. So right away, 5 small states ratify the Constitution because the Senate was really good for small states. So they were like, this is a heck of a deal, we're on. But there was one big problem. There was the giant in the room, the most powerful state of the 13 colonies. You know who it was? Anybody have any idea?
New York.
Wasn't New York, wasn't New Jersey. What?
Was it Virginia?
Virginia, yes, it was Virginia. Virginia had all the wealth, and they didn't like this Constitution particularly much. And so they began to argue about this. And there were 2 people that argued from Virginia about this. There was the great Patrick Henry. He was considered the greatest orator of the time. He could talk his way out of a paper bag. He was like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton could spin a tale and you'd think, wow, that's true. And you'd think, well, that's not true. But Bill Clinton, the way he said it, you'd think it was true. So you had Patrick Henry on the one hand, and he was opposing this ratification of the Constitution. And then you had bumbling James Madison. And in the notes, a lot of times you'd have all the notes from Patrick Henry's speech, and then it would say James Madison inaudible. And he'd be, well, I think we need to do this. And so those 2 are fighting it out, and Henry's just cleaning his clock. So he's got Virginia basically on the train of no. And the big issue that they're fighting over is a Bill of Rights. They're saying, okay, we have a constitution, but it doesn't guarantee us as citizens particular rights. And so they make 2 big things to get this ratified. One was they said, okay, if the states will ratify this, first order of business for the new government will be to create a Bill of Rights. So you have our word for that. And this was at a time when people were actually good for their word. If a man stood up and said, you know, I give you my word, we're going to work on a Bill of Rights, first order of business, you actually believed them. They kept their campaign promises to a degree. But the other thing was, remember who was born in Virginia? It was George Washington, right? So the other kind of quid pro quo was, if you ratify this, our first president will be a Virginian, George Washington. And so that combination of Washington and the promise of a Bill of Rights allowed them to push through ratification of the Constitution. The other small thing, which was an important thing, was Washington had no biological son. So do you know what that meant? It meant for those who feared that this was going to devolve back into a monarchy, it couldn't, because he didn't have a son to hand the throne to, right? So that put a lot of the folks at ease, that this was indeed going to be a republic and a democracy and not a monarchy. So they tapped Washington, but Washington again is happy to just work on his farm in Virginia at Mount Vernon. And he doesn't really want to leave private life. He's experienced that as general. He's taken the arrows from all different sides and the criticisms and all sorts of stuff. But it says he left to serve with, quote, this is what he said, with a mind oppressed with more anxious and painful sensations than I have words to express, to render service to my country. So here's a guy that isn't seeking the power. Think about how hard these people charge to get power today, whether it's congressional power or mayoral power or, you know, president power. And then here's a guy who's reluctantly being dragged into this. But think about our scriptures. Think about how the humble are those who are exalted, those who don't seek it. Those who seek to serve, though, end up being the greatest among us. And so when Washington was inaugurated, he actually bowed to both the House and the Senate during that inauguration. It was a symbolic gesture that said, the power lies within the people, because these were the representatives of the people. It was a democracy, not a monarchy. I was thinking about the church and how in our particular denomination we believe in the priesthood of all believers, that the power isn't with a pope or a bishop or a particular priest or a pastor, it's with the people. And it was the same thing how they set the government up of the United States. The power was with the people. And so Washington is president. They begin debating the Bill of Rights, and Washington becomes president. He takes the oath of office, and being president back then, think about it. There was no White House back then. Washington didn't exist. It was named after him later, and we can get into why it's in Washington, but they wanted to go between the free and the slave states. That's why they carved out between Maryland and Virginia. But we'll get into that another time. But there was no place for him to go. The capital, if you will, was in New York City. And so Washington basically set out to travel around to different areas of the country, try and begin to unite the people and to be, you didn't have mass media, you didn't have social media, you didn't have radio, television, any of those ways. So the only way to get to know the people and what was going on was to go talk to the people. And so he went out to be among the people. But one of the interesting things was the British, when they were still in control, forced people to put up their soldiers and their officers in their homes and feed them. And it was a great imposition. You can imagine forced company in your house, right? Nobody likes that. And so Washington, as a matter of principle, would not stay in a private residence. So he stayed in these rooming houses, which were for kind of the rundown. It'd be like Fulton Manor right next door, right? It's like not very nice. It was kind of housing of last resort. This was before hotels and motels and resorts and all that. These were just flop houses, more or less. So Washington, as the president of the United States, a man of some wealth, is staying in these flop houses. And the Americans began to see, wow, this is a servant leader. He's coming to be among us, staying in some really sketchy quarters just to talk to us. And that seemed to really resonate with them. But the groups he talked to most in his presidency and wrote to most were the churches. He wrote letters in his first 100 days to the United Baptist churches, the Presbyterian churches, and the Methodist churches, and his message was twofold: respect decisions of conscience, and by living to the highest ideals of the faith, we make citizens that are pious, honest, industrious, moral, and benevolent. 1789, he wrote to the Quakers, and he said, while they do not share in the bearing arms for the common defense — he's a little irritated with the Quaker pacifist position, right? He says they are exemplary and useful citizens, and he is committed as president to protect their conscientious scruples. So there's a degree of respect there. Here's a military general who believes and sees the need for bearing arms, but he respects these peaceable Quaker people. In 1789, he talks to the Dutch Reformed churches in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. In 1790, he goes to the Committee of Roman Catholics with the assurance they will be protected by their government. So some of this bias and prejudice that had been happening, no more, not on his watch. That was a great assurance to the Catholic Church. In August 1790, he went to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. He talked about toleration, natural rights, no place again, just like the Catholics, for bigotry or for persecution. So he's beginning to build this religious tolerance as part of the new nation. On March 4th, 1797, his presidency ended, but 2 days before, he wrote a final letter. It was to the Episcopal churches. He said, I'm thankful for prayers and public worship and witness of the churches. Government is approved by heaven to promote peace. And so he stepped away. In 1783, Washington said, we should publicly acknowledge our supreme ruler of the universe for rescuing our country from the brink of destruction. I cannot fail at this time to ascribe all the honor of our late successes to the same glorious being. A guy named Jared Sparks was Washington's biographer, and he believed Washington to be an Orthodox Christian. But because of his tolerance, some thought him not a Christian. So it was interesting, because he protected the rights of the Hebrew, the person who didn't want to worship or have any faith at all, or the Catholic, even though he was Episcopalian. Some thought he was not a devout Christian. And so Sparks wrote in the letter about Washington, he writes, quote, sure, there never was a people who had more reason to acknowledge a divine interposition in their affairs than those in the U.S., or failed to consider the omnipotence of God, who alone is able to protect men. Sparks talked about the way Washington lived his life was a witness and testament to his Christian faith. He said Washington was profoundly affected by the moral teachings of Jesus, and he felt he could best serve religion by ensuring that no single denomination be given government authority over the others. We rejoice that in this land, the light of truth and reason has triumphed over the power of bigotry and superstition, that every person here may worship God according to the dictates of his own heart. So you can see how this man was wired, how he believed, how he thought about all that was and all that was to be. I'm missing a page here. There we go. So when we look back at the totality of Washington's life, he was the commander of the Continental Army. He had that great power. He defeated mighty Great Britain, and yet he turned in his resignation, placed Knox in charge, and dissolved the army. He pushed that power away. He went to the Continental Congress. He could have strong-armed them into certain things he believed about all sorts of various aspects of the Constitution, yet he didn't do that. He continued to look toward a larger goal of crafting this Constitution, of having it ratified by the states, and having a system of government within America. And then the final act, and again, he was dragged into this. in service to others was to serve as president. And what's interesting is he, at the end of his first term, he was done. He was ready. He was an old man. He was tired. Can you imagine serving in those three capacities? How draining that would have been? So he was done, and yet they said, we really need you to serve a second term. And that first term, everything had been about just kind of getting this new nation off the ground, right? And he did it. He got them to get the Bill of Rights through. He created some sort of system of government with a cabinet and all these things, right? So he reluctantly goes into the second term. Right away in that second term, 4 years into nationhood essentially for the United States, the partisan power-grabbing fighting begins. And they begin to just rip at one another and rip at him. And that's the period where he goes from being this exalted founding father by the masses to the wicked stepfather of the country, because they're mad at him, because he's not getting into all this partisan rancor. And so his second term is actually marked by a lot of tug of war and a lot of hardship for him. And so he begins to see that, just like in the Bible, where the mother comes wanting her two sons to be exalted in Jesus, that is part of our human nature, right? We want to be the greatest, to have the most privilege. And yet that ends up leading us down roads that put us toward the bottom. George Washington is considered the greatest of the founding fathers, yet he would recoil at being called a founding father, as it conflicts with Matthew 23. Furthermore, Washington's greatness was a result of him eschewing power. The more he pushed power away, the more people trusted him to serve in power. His ideal was to serve others and serve the common good. Such was the way of Christ. Today we view Washington as a great patriot, but he was also a great disciple. So today, as you think about your own life, if you want to be a better leader or a better spouse or a better citizen or a better disciple, think first about how you can serve others. Think first about how you can suppress your own desires to serve the greater good. Think about how you can humble yourself and take the lowliest roles. And in doing so, you may one day find that you were viewed on earth and in heaven as a great citizen, a great human, and a great disciple of Christ. Amen.
Amen.